Hi, I'm Timothy Miller, and welcome to our series on the Joseph Code. In my personal quest for the truth, I found that the story of the real Jesus of Nazareth was a mystery wrapped in an enigma. However, I also found clues. Little did I know that my system of belief concerning Jesus and Christianity was about to be turned upside down. The accounts of Jesus' resurrection in the New Testament are both exciting and perplexing. As far as the resurrection itself is concerned, whether Jesus was literally dead before being placed in Joseph's tomb is immaterial from a legal standpoint. If he was believed dead by the authorities, including Pontius Pilate and the chief priests and elders, he was in fact legally dead, regardless of his actual physical condition. The details that Jesus was removed from the cross in a relatively short span of time, placed in a new and unused tomb owned by a follower, and that spices known for their healing qualities were applied to his body, cannot be brushed aside. Neither can we ignore the fact that the man placed in the tomb was highly disciplined in the esoteric sciences, or that the Essenes were known for their mastery of the healing arts. Jesus also had among his disciples people who could have warned him about the threats against his life. Joseph of Arimathea, a man of some wealth and means, is described as being a secret follower of Jesus. Joanna, the wife of Herod's own steward, was also a follower. And Nicodemus, himself a Pharisee and a ruling elder, was able to stay abreast of the conspiracies being hatched by the chief priests and the Pharisees of his own party. In Acts chapter 2, verses 24 through 28, we have Peter quoting Psalms in reference to Jesus, and he specifically references Psalm 16:27. "You will not abandon me to the grave, nor let your Holy One see decay." According to the Gospel of John, Jesus himself stated, "Therefore my Father loves me, because I laid down my life that I may take it again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down and power to take it up again." The resurrection accounts found in the Gospels are rather odd, in that they all tell a similar story, but they don't tell the same story. In Matthew chapter 28, we find that of all the Gospel accounts, only Matthew mentions a guard at the tomb being spooked and falling like dead men when an angel appears at the tomb. Mary Magdalene and another Mary are the first witnesses. They are portrayed as going to look at the tomb. They see angels and encounter Jesus. Both the angels and Jesus instruct the women to tell the disciples to meet Jesus in Galilee. Jesus is quoted as saying, "There they will see me." Matthew records no instance of an appearance of Jesus in the upper room in Jerusalem, but insists the disciples first saw Jesus on a mountain in Galilee. In Mark chapter 16, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome arrive with the intention of breaking into the tomb, as they wondered, who will roll away the stone for us? Why they want to gain entrance to the tomb is not mentioned. They see an angel. They tell no one about this because they were afraid. The earliest manuscripts of Mark end here. The encounter with Jesus, including the whole of Mark chapter 16 verses 9 through 20, are not part of the earliest manuscripts. Here we are told that Jesus first appeared to Mary Magdalene, who went and told the story to those who were mourning and weeping over Jesus' death on the cross. They didn't believe her. Later, Jesus appears to two unidentified persons walking in the country. They tell the disciples, but they don't believe them either. Later, Jesus himself appears to the 11 while they are eating and rebukes them for their lack of faith. In Luke chapter 24, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Joanna, and another unidentified woman arrive with spices. The Gospel of Luke goes on to state that the women saw angels. The first appearance of the resurrected Jesus is to two disciples on the road to Emmaus, an expansion on the story told in the later renderings of the Gospel of Mark. At first, the two disciples don't recognize him. During the course of their conversation, these two also inform Jesus that none of the women who went to the tomb saw him, a complete contradiction of the accounts of Matthew, Mark, and John. According to Luke's account, the two disciples don't recognize Jesus until he breaks bread with them, after which he abruptly disappears. They return to Jerusalem and meet the 11 remaining disciples and inform them that the Lord has risen and appeared to Simon, or Peter. How they happen to know about Peter's supposed encounter with Jesus is never explained in the text. At this point in the story, Jesus suddenly appears in the room. In the Gospel of John, Mary Magdalene arrives alone and goes to Peter to inform him that the tomb is empty. She accompanies him back to the tomb with another disciple. Peter and the other disciple leave, and Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene. She then goes and informs the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." Jesus himself appears to them later that evening while they are all locked up in a room for fear of the Jews. The Apostle Paul states in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 that Jesus appeared first to Cephas, or Peter, then the 12, then 500 of the brothers at the same time, and then to James and all the apostles. He never mentions an appearance to any of the women. In these accounts, Jesus is not portrayed as being an apparition or a disembodied spirit. Where the details of Jesus' ascension are concerned, there is no continuity in the gospel accounts. In the Gospel of Mark, there is no mention except for the later editions of Mark chapter 16 verses 9 through 20. The location is not given, although it appears from the context of the text that this was in the upper room in Jerusalem. According to this account, after Jesus spoke to the disciples, he was received up into heaven. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus was last seen on a mountain in Galilee. According to Luke, the ascension took place just outside the town of Bethany. In the Gospel of John, Jesus was last seen by the Sea of Galilee, rendered the Sea of Tiberias in the text. This was his highly symbolic third appearance to them, according to the author, although it contains the detail that they did not recognize him. The narrative includes the story of a miraculous catch of 153 large fish, a number loaded with esoteric numerological symbolism. According to the author, Jesus prepared fish and bread for breakfast for the disciples. In the book of Acts, due to the odd arrangement of the context, the location of the ascension occurs either in Jerusalem or at the Mount of Olives. The author of Luke Acts is the only source who provides any information as to a visible ascension event. In the midst of my investigation into Jesus' resurrection, I also considered the evidence revealed by the Shroud of Turin. Despite the controversy surrounding this relic, I believe it is, in fact, the burial shroud of Jesus and not some medieval forgery. Why? Well, when every medieval artist was getting the crucifixion anatomically wrong, how is it that this image is anatomically and historically correct right down to the caplet of thorns? Where did this forger find an authentic Roman flagrum? And what model or corpse was used that exactly and correctly mimicked a crucified male? At no point does this image appear to be that of a statue or a painting. How could a medieval forger envision putting both a three-dimensional image and a photographic negative of a crucified man on a piece of cloth? Many experts have stood by a 1988 carbon-14 dating of scraps of the cloth carried out by labs in Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona that dated it from 1260 to 1390 AD, which of course would rule out its use during the time of Christ. However, the carbon dating also matches very closely with the dates that written records indicate the cloth was known to be in Liry, France. Recent studies show that the samples cut for testing may have contained elements of fabric that were added later to repair the relic using an invisible mending and fabric repair technique developed, not surprisingly, in France. A new series of tests conducted in 2013 by scientists at the University of Padua in northern Italy disputes the earlier findings. Giulio Fanti, professor of mechanical and thermal measurement at the University of Padua's engineering facility, used a method measuring the degradation of cellulose in linen fibers from the shroud and another series of mechanical tests designed to measure the compressibility and breaking strength of the fibers. The research includes 3 new tests, 2 chemical ones and 1 mechanical one. The first 2 were carried out with an FTIR system, one using infrared light and the other using Raman spectroscopy. The third was a multi-parametric mechanical test based on 5 different mechanical parameters. According to Fanti, the separate approaches show the cloth is at least 2,000 years old. It has long been argued that the earlier carbon-14 testing results may have been skewed by contamination from fibers used to repair the cloth when it was damaged by fire in the Middle Ages. The new examination dates the shroud to between 300 BC and 400 AD, which would put it in the era of Christ. Fanti compared his results with 9 other ancient textiles of known origins with ages from 3000 BC to 1000 AD and 2 modern fabrics. Having taken into account differences resulting from the various environments and pollutant levels to which the fabrics were exposed, he is confident that any remaining unaccounted variables are included in the 500-year window within which he placed his primary date of 33 BC. The tests also supported earlier results claiming to have found traces of dust and pollen on the shroud that could only have come from the Holy Land. It is also obvious that the man in this cloth, if in it for 40 hours, is not dead as we understand death. Putrefaction follows a predetermined timetable in nature, and after the first 36 hours, the neck, the abdomen, the shoulders, and the head begin to turn a discolored green. This is then followed by bloating, an accumulation of gas that is produced by bacteria within the deceased. This bloating is most visible around the face, where the eyes and the tongue protrude as the gas inside pushes them forward. As the body continues to putrefy, the skin blisters, the hair falls out, and the fingernails of the deceased begin to sink back into the fingers. The resultant skin blisters are also filled with large amounts of liquid, just as in a blister you might get from running or walking too far. Some have noted that there appear on the shroud flows of blood that indicate that the circulatory system was still active. If the body was washed before being placed in the cloth, as the well-defined scourge wounds that appear in the cloth seem to indicate, there are trails of blood that are difficult to explain. This includes the blood flow on the forehead, the wrist, the long trailing blood flow from the side wound, and the blood trail extending from the feet. The summary from the 1978 Shroud of Turin research project concludes that no pigments, dyes, paints, or stains have been found on the fibrils. X-ray, fluorescence, and microchemistry on the fibrils precludes the possibility of paint being used as a method for creating the image. Ultraviolet and infrared evaluation confirm these studies. Computer image enhancement and analysis by a device known as a VP8 image analyzer show that the image has unique three-dimensional information encoded in it. Microchemical evaluation has indicated no evidence of any spices, oils, or any biochemicals known to be produced by the body in life or in death. It is clear that there has been a direct contact of the shroud with the body, which explains certain features such as scourge marks as well as blood. However, while this type of contact might explain some of the features of the torso, it is totally incapable of explaining the image of the face with the high resolution that has been amply demonstrated by photography. The basic problem from a scientific point of view is that some explanations which might be tenable from a chemical point of view are precluded by physics. Contrariwise, certain physical explanations which may be attractive are completely precluded by the chemistry. For an adequate explanation for the image of the shroud, one must have an explanation which is scientifically sound from a physical, chemical, biological, and medical viewpoint. At the present time, this type of solution does not appear to be obtainable by the best efforts of the members of the shroud team. Furthermore, experiments in physics and chemistry with old linen have failed to reproduce adequately the phenomenon presented by the Shroud of Turin. The scientific consensus is that the image was produced by something which resulted in oxidation, dehydration, and conjugation of the polysaccharide structure of the microfibrils of the linen itself. Such changes can be duplicated in the laboratory by certain chemical and physical processes. A similar type of change in linen can be obtained by sulfuric acid or heat. However, there are no chemical or physical methods known which can account for the totality of the image, nor can any combination of physical, chemical, biological, or medical circumstances explain the image adequately. Thus, the answer to the question of how the image was produced or what produced the image remains now, as in the past, a mystery. We can conclude for now that the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The blood stains are composed of hemoglobin and also give a positive test for serum albumin. The image is an ongoing mystery, and until further chemical studies are made, perhaps by this group of scientists, or perhaps by some scientists in the future, the problem remains unsolved. In the opinion of many, the cause of death appears to be that the figure on the shroud died from the cardiopulmonary failure typical of crucifixion. However, a certain cause of death cannot be determined without an actual autopsy, nor can the presence of rigor mortis be determined with any real certainty, although some have ventured to presume it. The well-defined scourge wounds that appear on the cloth indicate the body was washed before being placed in it. The image is more distinct in areas where the cloth had direct contact or close proximity with the body. The committees note that microchemical evaluation has indicated no evidence of any spices, oils, or any biochemicals known to be produced by the body in life or in death seem to contradict known facts. Taken in context, this could only apply to areas of the cloth void of apparent bloodstains. The forensic doctor, Biama Balone, was the only qualified expert who picked up in person and analyzed the blood from the threads of the Shroud of Turin. And he writes, "On the threads of bloodstains, a larger quantity of mineral-based materials is also present, which corresponds to that of experimental stains made by mixtures of blood, aloe, myrrh, and saponin. Forensic investigations of hematology are demonstrative for the presence of blood." Now, allow me to highlight something here. In the Shroud of Turin Research Project summary, they noted that the scientific consensus is that the image was produced by something which resulted in oxidation, dehydration, and conjugation of the polysaccharide structure of the microfibrils of the linen itself. It is apparent that the image was caused by prolonged exposure of the cloth to a very consistent and as yet unexplained energetic pulse. What was that? Well, let's just assume that after 3 days of energy pulsing from an incredibly powerful aura that was preserving this body, the fabric slowly started to oxidize, dehydrate, and conjugate. The aura is the electromagnetic field that surrounds the human body and every organism and object in the universe. The human energy field is a collection of electromagnetic energies of varying densities that permeate through and emit or exit from the physical body of a living person. These particles of energy are suspended around the healthy human body in an oval-shaped field. This auric egg emits out from the body approximately 2 to 3 feet on all sides. It also extends above the head and below the feet into the ground. The phenomenon of electrical coronal discharges, commonly referred to as an aura, have been captured using Kirlian photography. Colors typical of the human aura are red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. In addition, there is also a phenomenon known as white auric energy, which seems to indicate a pure state of light. It often represents a new, not yet designated energy in the aura and has spiritual, etheric, transcendent, higher dimensional, and non-physical qualities. Was it a powerful auric energy pulse that preserved Jesus' body and allowed it to perfectly absorb the healing balm prepared by Joseph and Nicodemus? This might sound crazy, but one should keep in mind that we are talking about a man who is reported to have healed the sick, raised the dead, walked on water, and according to John 6:21, folded the space-time continuum with a bunch of men in a boat. Jesus himself was quoted as saying, "Therefore my Father loves me, because I lay down my life, that I may take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down and power to take it up again." In conclusion, what we know about Jesus today is reliant on sources extant to Jesus himself. Unfortunately, Jesus never wrote anything about himself or his teachings. Yet his life has inspired a great amount of literature, as evidenced by the New Testament canon and the numerous texts rejected by church orthodoxy. In addition, we have the discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library, a collection of 13 ancient codices containing over 50 texts that were discovered in Upper Egypt in 1945. Much, but not all of the content of the Nag Hammadi writings were written from a Gnostic viewpoint, which came to be deemed heretical by the early Roman Church. A common characteristic of many of the Gnostic groups was the belief that the realization of gnosis, or esoteric intuitive knowledge, was the way to the salvation of the soul from the material world. Among the findings at Nag Hammadi was the Gospel of Thomas, an early Christian, non-canonical sayings gospel that many scholars believe provides insight into the oral gospel traditions. The Gospel of Thomas is composed of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. Almost half of these sayings resemble those found in the canonical Gospels. Many scholars have seen it as evidence in support of the existence of the so-called Q source, a sayings gospel that was a collection of sayings of Jesus without any accounts of his deeds or his life and death. It is apparent that Jesus' esoteric teachings about the coming kingdom of God were interpreted as exoteric and literal by later followers of the movement. After the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, the original oral traditions were written down, edited, and distributed to buttress the flagging hopes of the faithful who had expected to see the literal coming of the kingdom of God on earth at that time. The Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke were composed independently of one another sometime in the late 80s or 90s of the current era. Many scholars believe that both used the written form of the Gospel of Mark as source material for their own narratives. Because both Matthew and Luke contain a large amount of material in common that is not found in Mark, most researchers hold that the unknown authors of these texts also had a collection of Jesus' sayings that they incorporated into their works. This saying source is known as Q and was likely assembled in the late 40s or 50s of the current era. This understanding of the origins of the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke explains why they are similar yet different from one another. The Gospel of John emerges from an independent literary tradition that is not directly connected to the so-called synoptic tradition of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And this explains the major differences between John and the other Gospels. The narrative is indebted to oral and possibly written traditions that were transmitted from earlier decades. The Gospel of John is usually dated by scholars to around 90 to 110 of the current era. The one thing we can know for certain is that the man known as Jesus of Nazareth was not merely the product of a first-century imagination or the invention of the Roman Empire under Vespasian, as some have claimed. The early church, headed by James the Just in Jerusalem, would never have existed if this were the case. It is also evident, as noted by the testimonies of many who have encountered him, that the Spirit of Jesus is still among us today. The persecutions and murders carried out in his name by man-made institutions in the centuries following his appearance on earth, and the divisions that exist between modern Christian institutions have nothing to do with Jesus himself, but have everything to do with man's own duplicity and egocentric, self-destructive thinking. Despite the issues raised by a historical examination of the origins of Christian belief, I found it would be a major mistake to pass judgment on the historical veracity of the life and teachings of the man Jesus based solely on the accounts written about him. I did not come to the conclusion that the gospel accounts were a complete fiction, Rather, it became very clear that the original gospel story had been subject to spurious additions, deliberate deletions, and some rather prejudiced pro-Pauline doctrinal editing mixed with purely anti-Semitic propaganda. I believe there is enough surviving evidence in biblical and extra-biblical sources to at least identify Jesus and his brothers James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon, and his sisters as the product of the union of Joseph and Mary, who occupied the hamlet of Nazareth in Galilee. The family was part of the Essene Nazarite community that lived there. Joseph and Mary were most likely gifted spiritual adepts in their own right. Jesus himself was the firstborn son of Joseph and Mary, and the product of a triune messianic bloodline that united the houses of Levi, Joseph, and Judah. He was also an anointed one, spiritually gifted in the esoteric arts of prophecy, miracles, teaching, and healing. He had become one with the esoteric knowledge that a divine spark exists within mankind, and he deliberately chose to fan that spark into a flame in his own life. He was able to master the forces of nature because he had first mastered himself. He sought to bring enlightenment to the people of his time in a language and terms that they could understand. He clearly foresaw and prophesied about the eventual fall of Jerusalem and the end of the sacrificial temple cult. It was his mission and purpose to expose those who had ears to hear to a more direct and personal, esoteric and spiritual relationship to God, rather than one dependent on the exoteric forms of temples, rituals, and sacrificial burnt offerings. The people who recorded Jesus' doctrine had only a rudimentary knowledge of it. He instinctively knew his time was short. Like John the Baptist before him, he did not have the luxury of explaining to the masses the finer points of Essene theology. Rather, his goal was to have them open their hearts, renew their thinking, and be ritually purified by baptism. The New Covenant theology Jesus was credited with establishing had long been one of the foundational precepts of the Essene movement. As the Qumran texts plainly indicate, the Qumran community adapted the term New Covenant for its codex of laws, and the concept was encompassed in the social and religious life of the community. The term New Covenant and the ideology behind it was new only to the majority of the uninitiated people of Jesus' time, and had its roots in ancient Essene traditions that may have dated back to the time of the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten, who abandoned traditional Egyptian polytheism and introduced monotheistic worship centered on the Aten, the giver of light and life, symbolized in the life-giving solar disk. Jesus was not being contradictory when speaking of bringing both peace and a sword to the earth. He understood that the same word could be delivered to two men with different results. One would receive it as bringing life and peace, and the other could view it as a threat to their own belief system and violently reject it. I encourage you to do your own research, your own seeking, and let yourself be guided by the internal spirit of wisdom, peace, and love.